I was in the United States Air Force from January 18th, 1964 until October 18th, 1968. I got out of the Air Force 4 months early to go back to school, basically. When I left, my rank was sergeant. I had a top secret crypto security clearance. I had worked with Tactical Air Command in Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, the 44th Reconnaissance Technical Group. The group was involved in photographic reconnaissance. They were working with the U-2 planes, the spy satellite photography before anyone knew we had it at that point in time. No one knew that we were doing spy photography, spy satellite photography. Of course, no one knew we had the U-2 program operating, or what the capabilities of that program were. We also did gun camera and reconnaissance film from C-130s, all sorts of aircraft that were going into combat situations. We processed the film for that. It was 1965. I believe it was about June or July of 1965, sometime in that time frame. My boss came to me. I was working in a color lab at that time. I was a technician, photographic technician, with a background in electronics. I'd been trained in electronic photographic repair in Colorado at Lowry Air Force Base. Actually, the school was a year long. The organization that I was in was a brand new installation. It was put in place to facilitate the escalation of the Vietnam War. So we were in a new facility. I had come there in January of 1965 to start that facility up. We installed all the equipment. There were everything from printing presses. We were doing map making as well. We were also, one of the things we were involved in was doing automatic terrain sensing. We had simulators that did terrain. You put a huge map in the facility, in the simulator, a terrain map, and you flew a camera over that and did a recording of the terrain, and then they installed that film in a plane, and the plane could then fly in under radar. It was called ATRAN, and no one knew we had that capability at the time as well. So we were installing all of that equipment. At any rate, I was in a color lab one day when my boss, Staff Sergeant Taylor, came over to me and said that they were having a problem with some equipment on the base, and it was the first Lunar Orbiter program, where they had a mission to pretty much locate the first landing sites for the 1969 lunar mission for the astronauts. So at any rate, he said they were having some problem with equipment over there. It was a similar equipment that we had. It was computerized contact printing equipment. And he wanted to know if I would go over and take a look at it. And he said to me, it's an NSA facility. And at the time, I didn't know what NSA was. I was pretty naive, and I thought he said NASA. So in my mind, for a long time, I thought it was a NASA facility that I'd gone to. But I remembered him saying NSA and converting it in my own mind to NASA.
And for viewers, the NSA is? It's
the National Security Agency. And I didn't know much about the National Security Agency until probably 10 or 15 years ago. Now the interesting thing, when my boss came to me at that point in time, I only had a top secret security clearance. I didn't get my crypto security clearance for a few more weeks. It takes years to get a high-level security clearance like that, and they start that when you're in school. And only the honor graduates from these schools are the people who get the high-level security clearances. They also get to choose their duty assignment, which is really quite nice. It just was a fluke. I just happened to be well prepared for what I was doing when I went to school.
And how did you get to be in a position where you actually were to deal with the material we are about to discuss?
I was asked to go over to this facility on Langley Air Force Base where the NSA was bringing in the information from the Lunar Orbiter. And so I packed up some tools. I went over. I went into the facility. As I approached the facility, it was very lightly guarded. I mean, the base was under high security at any rate. I was surprised that there wasn't a higher level of security outside of the facility as I look back on it later. I went into the facility, I gave them my low-level security badge, they gave me a higher-level security badge. A couple of officers took me into this hangar. It was a very large hangar. As I walked in, there were people from other countries, a lot of foreign people from other countries in civilian clothes, with interpreters with them, with security badges hanging around their neck. And the first thing I thought to myself, if this is NASA, what are all these foreigners doing here? What are all these people from other countries speaking other language? Didn't make any sense to me. And I was really quite impressed with that. It just didn't grok. I was, what are all of these people doing here? And they were very quiet, very reserved, and there was a very peculiar pall hanging over them. They had a very concerned demeanor. Okay, so they took me into this laboratory. I took a look at the equipment. There was an airman second class in there. I was an airman second class as well. He turned the equipment on and put it through its paces. It didn't do what it was supposed to do. I saw what was going on with it. I said, I need to do some troubleshooting on it. It had little printed circuit boards in it with discrete components at that time. It was before we had integrated circuits. And I said to him, we'll have to take this thing out of the lab if we're going to work on it. We can't work on it in here in the darkroom environment. So he called someone to get some people to come in and move it. It was about the size of a small apartment refrigerator. It wasn't something you could easily move. So everyone left the facility, left the darkroom, except this airman second class and myself. And we're in waiting for someone to come to remove this piece of equipment. So while I'm in there, I said to him, and I'm really fascinated with this process, how did they get the images from the Lunar Orbiter to the laboratory here? And he went through the whole process describing how the various radio telescopes around the world were linked and they telemetered the data into Langley Field. And at the time, I didn't know what the real purpose of this darkroom and this operation in this facility was. I thought this was where they were bringing the data in and then releasing the images to the public. I had no idea that there were other issues involved in this facility. So he starts telling me all of this information, and I knew that what we were doing was classified anyway, and that he could only share a certain level of what he was doing with me because of the compartmentalized nature of our jobs. At any rate, he told me how everything worked. He showed me the equipment where the digital information came in, where it was converted to photographic images. They were doing 35 millimeter strips of film at that time, which were then assembled into 18.5 by 11 inch mosaics, they were called. There was a digital signature and a grayscale on every 35 millimeter strip. And those strips were from successive passes around the moon, and they would take and build up a photograph. They would scan one section of the moon, then another and another, and then they would get a larger image. So this mosaic then would be put in that contact printer, and that was then a print that was issued to whomever, the press, the scientist, whatever, wherever that was intended to go. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon. And I said, whose? What do you mean, whose? He said, yes, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. And at that point, I became frightened, and I was a little terrified, thinking to myself that if anybody walks in the room now, I know we're in jeopardy, we're in trouble, because he shouldn't be giving me this information. I was fascinated by it, but I also knew that he was overstepping a boundary that he shouldn't be stepping over. And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers, and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. So I didn't say any more to him because I was concerned again that somebody was going to come in at any moment, would catch us having this conversation, and we would be in real trouble. I realized that he was telling me this information because he didn't have anybody else to talk to. Now, probably in that laboratory, he was probably one of the few enlisted people, and he was a worker bee. And he had a high-level security clearance, obviously, but he couldn't share that information with anybody else. And in those days, we didn't. When you had your security clearance, you took it seriously. It isn't like today where people don't take these things seriously. We had a different set of morals and ethics and values. That's the way we were raised, and we stayed bound by those agreements. So it was rare that someone would do something like this, but this fellow and I were the same rank. I think he was very distressed. He had the same pallor and demeanor as the scientists outside the room. They were just as concerned as he was, and he needed to discuss it with somebody. So that was the end of it right there. I didn't take it any further than that. I just filed it away. But the interesting thing, every day that I went home, I would think to myself, I can't wait to hear about this on the news, And, so I'd turn on the TV and I'd look at the news to see if they're going to announce, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon, being really naive, And of course, here it is 30-some years later, and we still haven't heard about it. But at the time, I had been given about 30 of these photographs. They weren't photographs with artifacts in them, but they were photographs from that contact printer. I had some of them autographed by Dr. Colley, who was the head of the project at that time. And when I left San Francisco a few years ago, I actually sold them all in a yard sale because I was tired of carrying them around. And I may have a couple of them filed away someplace, but it was probably one of the biggest mistakes I've ever made. What was really interesting is I'm not sure what the resolution on those photographs were, but I know that we could discern from the satellite photography we were doing at our installation, you could read the license number off a car at that point in time. So I know we had that level of technology available. Whether or not it was on that lunar orbiter, I don't know. And this also always brings to question, in my mind, why we're getting such low resolution on photographs that we receive from Mars and any of these other missions. The resolution of these photographs is very low, when we've had, since the early 60s, the capability of much higher resolution. So I'm not sure what that's all about. That question always comes up in my mind. If I compare it to what I'm seeing now, because I do have photographs that have artifacts in them that are similar to what I saw, they're massive. Some of the structures are, half a mile in size. So they're huge structures. Yeah, and they're all different size structures in different photographs. You would have to have an above top secret security clearance, which generally would be cryptologic or above. In my case, I ultimately did have a cryptologic security clearance, and when I did have that clearance, I had access to all of the imagery from the U-2s, from the satellite photography. I had access to everything we were doing. Now, the thing that was interesting about my job as an electronics technician, I got to go into every area of the facility. I got to go into the war room at SAC, Strategic Air Command, and did maintenance on equipment there. So I would see a lot of data that people generally wouldn't see with my rank. Normally you would go into your job, you'd do your one little task. If you were a photographic interpreter, that's all you did. You didn't discuss what you did with anyone else. If you worked on U2 imagery, you worked on U2 imagery. If you worked on satellite imagery, you worked on satellite imagery. But you didn't discuss your job with anyone else. And you only did your task. If you were a photographic processor, you only processed the images. You were not allowed to discuss what you saw in those images with anyone else. We were briefed extensively about what this compartmentalization looked like. You didn't have conversations about what you were doing. So for me, I got to go into all these different areas and see what each of these people were doing, and some of them did share what they were doing. They would have photographs of the missile emplacements above their desk that they'd discovered, or they'd have photographs of the missiles on the decks of the Russian aircraft carriers, or I'd see various fresh spoil from a satellite photography around a missile emplacement in the Sinai Peninsula, as an example. Well, we had in one room in our organization, we had a map of the Sinai Peninsula at that time that was made up from satellite photography. It was a mosaic. And it was 60 feet high and 60 feet wide. It was massive with great detail. So, I mean, it was fascinating. And I saw vehicles, and I saw vehicles on these satellite photography that you could read the license plate on. They actually showed me that, so I know that that was something that was real. At any rate, getting back to the compartmentalization, I had access to lots of different areas only because I was a technician moving from area to area. The only other person that would have had that kind of access would have been an officer with a high-level security clearance that had a need to know. Bottom line, if you didn't have a need to know, there wasn't any reason to discuss what you knew with anyone else. And even if someone asked, if they didn't have a need to know and they didn't have a security clearance, you couldn't discuss it with them. Everyone wears a security badge with a specific color, and you know that that color represents a specific level of security clearance. And as you move from area to area within an organization, you get into higher and higher levels of secure area. You'll go through a gate, you go into a vault, you exchange your badge for another badge of a higher level of security. You're briefed on your job as to what your level of conversation can be with another person. You know, I was told, don't ask, don't discuss, just go in and fix the equipment. We'd sit down with a security officer, and he would review what your activities were, what you were doing, what you were allowed to do. They didn't ask you what you'd seen, they knew what I was seeing because they knew what I had access to. I was told to be very cautious when I was off base. I was told not to drink. I was told not to get intoxicated. I was told not to do drugs. I was told to be very cautious of people striking up a friendship with me because there were people who were gathering this sort of information. There was a lot of espionage around the base, military espionage, or foreign espionage. You can cut that one out. At any rate, I was told, don't let anyone take my photograph. Be very cautious about where I traveled, when I traveled. I knew that I couldn't go any place for at least 5 years without telling the State Department where I was after I left the military. Anytime I traveled, I had to notify and get permission to travel any place I traveled at that point in time in the United States. They had to know where I was all the time. We were told that when we traveled over a foreign area, as an example, if we went to Vietnam, there was always someone there with us, with a gun, ready to annihilate us, basically, if we should fall into the hands of the enemy. They didn't want the enemy to get us. We would be killed instead. So we knew we were operating under these sort of conditions, that your life was in jeopardy all the time should you fall into the wrong hands. So we were aware of that. I was told when I left that I would be investigated on a regular basis to make sure that I wasn't involved in any peculiar activities that didn't suit the government's needs. My security clearance expired in, I believe it was either October or January of 1998. And it was about 1998 that I actually, after my security clearance expired, I discussed what I had seen with my sister because she was interested in the phenomena. I read Colonel Corso's book, The Day After Roswell. In the book he said a lot of fantastic things. And he also said, near the end of the book, that there was a base on the backside of the moon. And when he said that, I said, aha. So I began to believe that everything he was saying was true. And he was saying a lot of really profound things about the crash in Roswell and alien technology and whatever, and how it had been mainstreamed through the Office of Foreign Technology by himself. So I knew that he was probably telling the truth. It just said to me, this guy's telling the truth, because I've had this experience and I know it's real. Yeah, it was Edgar Mitchell. He said, come forward, and I said, okay, it's time to start stepping out with this information. Because I was a little irritated, that the government had been lying about all of this for years and covering it up. And I felt it was time to get beyond that. There's a lot more weight to this than I realized, a lot more cover-up than I realized. Yeah, a lot more deception than I realized was going on. Well, some of the shapes, as I said, some of the buildings were very tall thin structures. I don't know how tall they were, but they must be very tall.
Did you see profile shots of them?
I
or
saw
angular shots with
they
shadows?
were angular shots with shadows. There were spherical and domed buildings, that were very large. They must be, half a mile in scale, because they were, in relationship to the scale of the photograph, they stood out very clearly. They were large objects. It's interesting because I tried to relate them in my own mind to structures here on Earth, and they don't compare to anything that you see here in scale and structure. They're similar to a degree. I tried to relate them to metal structures, and I couldn't see a metal definition. They're more like a stone structure, but a fabricated stone. Some of the buildings seem to have very reflective surfaces on them. A couple of structures that I saw reminded me of cooling towers at power generating plants. They had that sort of a shape. Some of them were just very, very straight and tall with a flat top. Some of them were round. Some of them looked like a Quonset hut, with a domed kind of, like a greenhouse.
And all of these buildings were clustered together centrally?
The particular shot that I saw, there were several clustered together over a landscape, a fairly large landscape. Mm-hmm. There was one building that had a dish-like shape to it, but it was very large. It looked like a radar dish, but it was a building. It could have been a radar dish. There was another building near it with a truncated top, with an angular top that was truncated. I didn't want to look at it any longer than that because I felt that my life was in jeopardy. Do you understand what I'm saying? I would love to have looked at it longer. I would have loved to have had copies. I would love to have, said more about it or discussed it more, but I knew I couldn't. And I knew that young fellow who was sharing this was really, really overstepping his bounds at that point. I felt that he just needed somebody to talk to. He hadn't discussed it, couldn't discuss it, and he wasn't doing it for any ulterior motive other than the fact that I think he had the weight of this thing on him, and it was distressing to him.
It was whitish disc, totally silent apparently, flying extremely fast, and it had a bluish light on top, on the apex. It was that bluish colour that you get in arc welding, and that was coming on rhythmically, so that as it went across the sky, you could say it's coming on there, got to come on there, got to come on there, got to come on there.
My name is George A. Filer III. I don't normally use the third. But I was in the U.S. Air Force, and my final rank was major. I don't know what else you'd like to know. Well, have an MBA, and was a former vice president of MedCorps. In other words, I've done other things since leaving the Air Force. I was a navigator in various aircraft, tanker and transport aircraft. Flew last in C-141s at McGuire Air Force Base. I was also an intelligence officer most of my career as my desk job, so to speak. And I, in that period, frequently, briefed generals and congressmen on our capabilities and the threat to our forces. Well, I was normally, like I mentioned, a briefing officer, and I would come to work 4 o'clock or so in the morning. And on the morning of January 18th, 1978, I drove through the main gate at McGuire, and I noticed that there was red lights out on the runway, and that probably something was going on out on the runways there because of all the red lights and, you know, like police cars and fire trucks and so on. And didn't think too much about it until I got to 21st Air Force Command Post is where I worked. And I would go in there and prepare a briefing for
What
the
was your position there?
generals. I was a Deputy Director of Intelligence for 21st Air Force, which controlled, well, half the military aircraft and flew the presidents and various VIPs and from the Mississippi River around to India. We had some 300 aircraft and we were flying all kinds of missions, submarine crews, almost anything that had to do with the military airlift we accomplished. And this particular morning when I went into the command post, I was met by the head of the command post, and he said that it's been a very exciting evening, that we've had UFOs in the, you know, over the McGuire all night, and that one had apparently landed or possibly crashed at Fort Dix, and that when a military policeman came upon the alien, that he had pulled out a gun and shot them. And I said, you know, a foreigner, like, you know, an alien? I was a little bit confused by him saying alien. He says, no, an alien from outer space. He was very specific about the fact that an alien from outer space had been shot at Fort Dix, and that it had run away after being wounded and headed for McGuire. Now, McGuire and Fort Dix just have a fence between them, and this alien supposedly climbed the fence or went under it or whatever and got to McGuire and died out on the end of the runway. And that the security police were out there and had captured the body, so to speak, and were guarding it. And he said that a C-141 from Wright-Patterson was coming in to pick up the plane. Now that made me stand up because I didn't realize that Wright-Patterson had C-141s. I thought Military Airlift Command was the only one who owned C-141 aircraft. So I was like, you know, my gosh, what's going on here? And he says, we want you to brief this at the, you know, stand-up general briefing this morning and explain what happened to everybody. And I was like, do you want me to tell General Tom Sadler and everybody in the command post that, you know, we captured an alien? And they said, yes, we want you to brief that this morning. Well, I did some checking around, and I called the 38th Military Airlift Wing Command Post to check with them to see if, in other words, the story was the same that I was getting. And they said, yes, that they had heard that also, that this actually did happen, that an alien was found on the base. And later that morning, I was told that they decided not to brief it in the stand-up briefing. And so I didn't actually brief it. Now, the only other thing that was interesting is that that morning I carried what's code word down to the General Sadler's office, and I noticed some commotion going on in there, and that some of the security police people were there in rather disheveled and so on. And that General Sadler was a stickler for everybody looking perfect, and it was kind of surprising to see these people that obviously needed shaves and were in fatigues and so on there. So then I knew that that might tie into the story that I had heard. Now, after the briefing, I also went to the photo lab. Almost every day I went to the photo lab because in your briefings you have, well, 4 screens, and you have to keep them all, you know, filled up with pretty pictures and so on. And there they indicated that they had taken pictures of something extraordinary. And I said, well, let me see them. And the sergeant was handing it to me, and his master sergeant says he can't see those. So all I know is that they had some pictures that I wasn't allowed to see. But normally, being the general's briefer, I had never been, stopped from seeing any pictures that they had previously. There is nuclear assets on the base that they used to carry weapons back and forth to Europe and so on. I had done some checking around because I became interested. I talked to one of the security policemen who claims to have been out there, and he indicated that he essentially saw a small body that could have been like a child, but it seemed to have a larger than normal head. Now, one interesting thing is many of the key personnel on the base at that time who had a connection to with this were quickly transferred from the wing commander on down, indicating that if you knew something, they tended to split you up, so to speak, so you couldn't talk about it. Oh, within a matter of weeks or whatever. Now, the security policeman told me that he was transferred within a few days. Matter of fact, he was taken to Wright-Patterson within the day or two and debriefed by a number of people and essentially told not to talk about it anymore. Now, his story to me was that, they heard this going on the radios, and they heard that this chase was on, that the alien had been shot at Fort Dix and they were chasing it towards McGuire. At least for whatever reason, it chose to run towards McGuire Air Force Base, and that both the state police and the military police were, you might say, chasing this person or alien, whoever it was. They came from what looked like a UFO. As I understand it, was a disc-shaped craft. They indicated to me that the UFOs had been in the area for quite some time that evening, and that they had them on radar, and that the tower operator had seen them, and some of the other aircraft in the area had apparently seen them as well. 6 or 8 people guarding the body, and then there was the commander of the security police unit, and then we were told, a few of us in the command post, and I assume that General Sadler was briefed about it. Well, I happened to meet a lady who claimed to have been out of White Sands, and it was an engineer working out there, and she was out hiking one day, and she told me that her and a couple of her friends had come up to the top of a hill, and they could look down in this valley, but only their heads were showing, on the top of the hill. They just happened to be looking over and down the way the path was. And they had seen a UFO on the ground with a couple of little aliens kind of like picking up rocks and stuff. And they watched it for an extensive period. It was, several hundred yards away from them. And they got a pretty good look at it. And eventually the aliens did see them. And they jumped in the craft and took off. But I had personally never seen anything until about 1962. We were flying tankers over England, and London Control asked us to intercept a UFO. And we happened to be done with our refueling mission, and we accepted the assignment. We were on just over the North Sea, and they asked us to fly to the center of England, and we were doing, I don't know, some 400 miles an hour in a dive down to intercept this object. And they gave us headings, and it was pretty much hovering in the rough Stonehenge area, Oxford, Stonehenge area. And we got about, I'm not exactly sure, 20, 30 miles out, and I got it on radar. And it was a very large return. We used to fly up by the the Firth of Forth Bridge, which is kind of like the San Francisco Bay Bridge, but it's a very large bridge. And the return was similar to that in size and in intensity. In other words, it was a very large radar return. And obviously London Control had it on their radar, and they were vectoring us to this object. And when we got about a mile from it, as a matter of fact, we were diving on the thing, and the whole aircraft was shaking. And it just took off into space at several thousand miles an hour, almost directly up. And now this was at night. It reminded me a lot of the shuttle launch, you know, something going up very quickly at a high rate of speed. And frankly, at least to my knowledge, we had nothing like that capability. As a matter of fact, we said something about, you know, have any kind of rocket launches from that area, and they said no, that we could just go continue on our mission. So based on this lady's testimony and pretty much what we saw, I believe that there was something, you know, going on out there. My best guess is that it was a disc-type craft, but a fat disc. At least there was lights, you know, something like this at the top and at the bottom. It was more than just a straight plate-like object. It had a dome on the top of it. If the radar return was accurate, it was probably, you know, just guessing, 500 yards long or something. I mean, a huge thing. Something that bothered me a little bit, that they were very friendly as we're doing the intercept on the thing, and once the intercept was made and it had, essentially we chased it away, they didn't want to talk about it any further. We wrote it in the navigator's log, fairly detailed. Yeah, this is Briarwood Lake in Medford, New Jersey. And we had just moved into this house, and in any case, we were asleep about, I'm just guessing, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm asleep with my wife, and suddenly the room got very bright in the middle of the night. So I got up out of bed and opened up the shade, but most of the light was even coming through the shade. And looked outside, and I don't know if most people have seen a submarine surfacing with all the water coming off. Well, this was like a disc about 30 feet in diameter surfacing. And what looked to me like water coming off of it. But frequently I had flown the Atlantic and Pacific and so on, and seen the aurora borealis, or the northern lights, and around the craft were this ionization very similar to the aurora borealis. And it just kind of moved across the lake for a while and flew off at a fairly high rate of speed. Now, because of that, I've checked with a lot of the neighbors, and there's, I don't know the exact numbers, but there's like 40 or 50 lakes in Medford and Medford Lakes. And I frequently brought up the subject if they had seen anything. And it's amazing how many people have actually seen craft on the lakes. Well, occasionally I used to brief on the UFO sightings that had been occurred around the world to the generals. One that sticks out in my mind is 1976. There was a famous sighting in Tehran, Iran, where an F-4 or a couple F-4s chased a UFO. That kind of sighting I would brief on occasion to the generals, and they would be, you know, more or less interested. Then someone would stop by and say, well, you know, I had my sighting. We were flying 106s over Colorado or whatever, and we dove on the UFO sitting there. Very similar to my story, except I was in a 4-engine tanker, and they were in a, you know, 2 fighters. and they would dive on the thing. At that time, this particular colonel was telling me that the F-106 had set the world's record for speed, and they had these aircraft going as fast as they could, so to speak, diving on this UFO that was hovering in a valley in Colorado. And just like us, when they got near the craft, it took off and left them standing still, and they were doing like 1,500 or something, whatever the top speed was at that time for these aircraft in a dive. That these, who, you know, is flying these, have this capability that is far beyond anything we've had for years and years. I think even today, something, at least in my opinion, non-human. That has a different form of propulsion and is coming here and you know, doing reconnaissance and taking minerals or whatever it is that they happen to be doing. There are things going on, and they are being seen. You know, talked to a number of astronauts who have seen them. Talked to other military pilots and the like who have seen them, and I remember Captain Ramage, who I used to work for in Athens, Greece, and he had one during the Korean War fly right off his wing, stay with him for like an hour, and do not only off his wing but do, you know, acrobatic things around his aircraft. And I don't know the exact percentage of people, but probably 10% of the pilots and air crews that you ask about it have had sightings. A few years ago, a colonel who was in intelligence had his whole B-52 crew see it. And now, you know, these people don't, you might say, volunteer and sit in front of the camera and tell about it, but there's an awful lot of people who have seen them. They're not sure exactly what they are and what they're doing, but they know that they have advanced capability, and they usually see some kind of a you know, solid object that appears to be made of some kind of metal, usually a gunmetal gray. Usually with, particularly at night, people usually report various lights around them. It seems to me, I was told that it was put in some kind of a, you know, casket type thing, and taken away, so to speak, flown away. I think that in 1947 or in that time frame, something crashed out west. You know, whether it was Roswell, the specific Roswell that's been written about, but I think something happened out there, at least based on, you know, you might say the talk in the military that something crashed sometime out there. The tendency is to make things classified when you don't know what's happening. You know, secret, top secret, or whatever. And if it comes down from the president, it's a very high classification, probably code word above top secret. In other words, need to know, that kind of thing. And once that caveat or designation is put on something, it's very difficult to get it downgraded. I mean, you can go to the archives, and despite what they tell you, they have things going back to the Second World War that you still are not allowed to look at. And once these things are top secret or whatever, it's difficult to get it down. It just kind of moves on and forever stays top secret or whatever. They just keep it very classified and very secret, basing it on, you can base it on the fact, for example, that let's say this craft had advanced technological capabilities. So you don't want the other side, so to speak, to know what you know and how these things work and the like. It's to your advantage to keep this secret. I think that it's time that these various programs come out. Now, one of the things that I've found is that the way it's been kept secret to a big extent is the fact of through ridicule. If it always had been just top secret, I think most of the world would know about it tonight. But they put in a kind of a ridicule factor which made people, you'll hear somebody telling a story like this, they'll say, well, he must be crazy that he believes in UFOs. And they brought this out. When anyone saw anything, you know, there'd be two people, we'll say one has funny hair and looks wild and so on, and the guy standing next to him is a police officer. Well, they always interviewed the wild guy and never put the police officer on the screen. My experience has been an awful lot of policemen have seen these, an awful lot of FBI have seen these, an awful lot of military has seen it, and he might have the, like, at times I used to carry nuclear weapons. In other words, I was mentally fit to carry nuclear weapons, but I'm not mentally fit if I see a UFO. Well, this criticism and this ridicule has, I think, done more to keep the story coming out than almost anything else.
There was indeed a solid, structured craft in the air. It was traveling at a phenomenal speed compared to the envelope, as it were, of our own fighters. So jets were launched, and indeed the pilots did manage to close and get a visual sighting on